What happens when even the emperor stops listening? The question first came to him on the third night after the guns fell silent. Smoke still drifted above the ruins, and the air was thick with the scent of burnt metal and blood. He had always prayed before battle, whispered oaths into the static of his comms, traced the aquila across his armor, and waited for the faint hum that came in response. That hum had been his comfort. The emperor's whisper proved that he was still watching. But now, there was only silence, a silence so deep it rang in his skull like a wound. He told himself it was just exhaustion. That perhaps the emperor had spoken, but the roar of artillery had drowned his words. Yet when dawn came and the battlefield lay cold and still, there was still nothing. No whisper. No warmth. Only the quiet shuffle of corpses cooling beneath the sun. The guardsman walked among them, searching for anyone who might have heard the same divine echo, but all he found were mouths frozen mid-prayer. He tried to pray harder. Louder. With trembling hands, he carved words of devotion into the stock of his lasgun for the emperor, forever vigilant. He recited the catechisms he had memorized as a child, the ones taught by a priest whose name he could no longer remember. He even offered the last of his rations as a token of faith, leaving it upon a broken altar made of shrapnel and bone. But the sky remained empty. The emperor, it seemed, had turned his gaze elsewhere. For days, he wandered the wreckage of the war zone, surrounded by silence. The bodies of his comrades lay untouched, even the crows avoided this place. At night, he stared into the darkness and listened, waiting for that faint spark of the divine that once guided him through the madness. The longer he waited, the louder the silence became. It started to take shape, the sound of absence, of something vast and eternal having withdrawn its breath. He began to speak to the void, not expecting an answer but hoping that perhaps his words might reach the edge of whatever heaven the emperor resided in. "My lord," he whispered, "I am still here. I fight. I serve. But why do you not speak?" His voice cracked, small against the immensity of nothing. The wind carried his words away, scattering them like dust. Then came the dreams. Visions of golden light flickering through smoke, of massive cathedrals crumbling into oceans of ash. In those dreams, he saw himself kneeling before the golden throne, but the emperor was not there. Only a shadow sat upon the seat, robed in light so bright it blinded him. And in the light, he heard faint laughter. When he woke, he told himself it was just his mind breaking from fatigue. But the laughter stayed with him. He tried to silence it with ritual. He recited the litany of endurance until his throat bled. He burned offerings, sang hymns into the night, and forced his body to march through the mud until his legs failed. Still, the laughter whispered through the cracks in his resolve. "Faith," it said, "is only noise you make to hide the truth." By the seventh day, he could no longer tell if the voice was inside his head or outside it. The emperor's whisper was gone, but something else had taken its place, something that felt eerily familiar. It spoke in his own tone, his own cadence, as if his prayers had begun to echo back from the emptiness. He wanted to believe it was a sign. He wanted to believe the emperor had returned. But deep down, he felt the difference. The divine voice had once filled him with purpose, this one filled him with doubt. He found a broken mirror inside a ruined bunker and caught his reflection for the first time in weeks. His eyes were hollow, his face cracked with soot and blood. He could barely recognize the man staring back. "You're still loyal," he told himself. "You'll keep praying. You'll find him." But the reflection did not move its lips. Instead, he thought he saw it smile. As night fell once again, the guardsman dropped to his knees in the ruins of what used to be a chapel. The stars above flickered weakly, half hidden by smoke. He pressed his palms together and whispered one final prayer. "Please, if you can still hear me, send me a sign. Anything." The wind howled through the shattered walls, and the sound was almost like breathing. Almost. He waited for hours, unmoving, as the cold bit through his armor. When dawn finally broke, he opened his eyes to see the light spilling across the ruins pale and gold, like the memory of faith. But the warmth never touched him. Only the silence did. The kind of silence that feels alive. And so, he rose, gripping his lasgun like a relic, and turned toward the horizon. If the Emperor would not speak to him here, then he would go to the ends of the Imperium to find where he still whispered. The silence would not break him. It would guide him. He would walk until he found the voice again or until the void swallowed him whole. With that said, thanks for watching, and until next time. Do you know what faith sounds like when it begins to die? It isn't a scream, nor a shattering, nor even a cry for help. It's the quiet scraping of boots over dust, the slow rhythm of a man walking away from everything he once believed in. That was the sound of the Guardsman's faith now, each step a confession, each breath a plea swallowed by the void. The battlefield was far behind him, buried under smoke and the bones of the loyal. Ahead, only the wastelands stretched on broken cathedrals, half-sunken tanks, statues of saints leaning like drunks in the ruins. The world itself seemed to be praying for mercy that would never come. Days bled into nights without distinction. Hunger gnawed at him, thirst burned his throat, but worse than all of it was the absence of the divine. He had once believed that pain brought him closer to the Emperor, that suffering was a kind of communion, the body's way of offering itself to the golden flame. But now the pain was empty. It did not purify, it only hollowed. Each time he whispered a prayer, it felt heavier, like dragging words through mud. He found a pilgrim once, or what was left of one. The man was slumped beside a ruined Aquila statue, his robes torn, his eyes glazed. A parchment was nailed to his chest with a rusted nail. It read, "The Emperor is silent because we have nothing left to say." The guardsman stood over the corpse for a long time, reading the words again and again. The parchment fluttered in the wind like a heartbeat. He wanted to tear it down, to deny it, but instead he pressed two fingers to the man's forehead and whispered, "You are still his." It sounded false even to him. Later, he came upon the remnants of a burned-out chapel. Inside, amid the soot and shattered glass, knelt a figure clad in scorched armor, a sister of battle, her bolter resting across her lap. Her lips moved in silence, eyes fixed on the blackened altar. When he approached, she did not look up. "He doesn't speak anymore," she said softly. Her voice was like stone grinding against stone. "But he listens. That is enough." The guardsman almost believed her. For a moment, he thought he saw light flicker across her armor, a shimmer like candlelight reflected on gold. But when he blinked, it was gone. She turned her head slightly, and for the first time he saw her eyes. They were hollow, the kind of hollow that comes from staring too long at something that never answers. "Where are you going?" she asked. "To find where he still speaks," he said. Her cracked lips formed something between a smile and a wound. "Then you'll walk until your feet are bones. But perhaps that is the only pilgrimage left." When he left her behind, he could still hear her whispering prayers into the dead air. The sound followed him for miles, a rhythm of devotion and despair so alike they were indistinguishable. He crossed valleys where nothing grew, plains of glass melted by orbital fire, and rivers turned black with ash. The stars above offered no comfort. They looked down cold and unmoved, like the eyes of saints carved in stone. Still, he walked, muttering the litanies of faith under his breath until they became meaningless syllables. One night, a storm swept through, acid rain cutting like knives, lightning revealing the shapes of old shrines long devoured by decay. He found shelter beneath the wreckage of a tank and huddled there, clutching his rifle like a cross. Sleep came in fits, twisted and feverish. In his dream, he was standing before a golden door. He could hear voices behind it, soft, distant, singing hymns in a language he almost understood. He reached out to open it, but when his hand touched the surface, the gold began to peel away. Beneath it was flesh, living, pulsing, breathing. The voices turned to screams. He woke gasping, bile rising in his throat, the echo of those screams still in his ears. At dawn, he found tracks in the dust, boot prints, fresh ones. They led to a small shrine half buried in sand. A figure knelt inside, cloaked in rags, mechanical limbs humming faintly. A servitor. Its lips moved, repeating a single line over and over, "The Emperor protects. The Emperor protects." But its tone was wrong, too calm, too mechanical, too hollow. The guardsman listened for a while, then knelt beside it. "How long have you prayed?" he asked. The servitor's head turned with a slow creak. "Praying, 472 years, 6 months, 9 days. He felt something twist inside him. Not pity, envy. The machine still had purpose. It would pray forever without doubt or fear. Its voice would never falter. Its faith would never rot. "Do you hear him?" the guardsman whispered. The servitor paused. Its lenses flickered faintly. Then, with perfect calm, it said, "No input detected." He stood and left without another word. That night, he climbed a ridge and looked down upon the broken landscape stretching to infinity. Somewhere out there, he told himself, the Emperor still whispered. Somewhere, the divine voice still burned bright. He just had to keep walking. He had to keep believing. But as he whispered his nightly prayer, the wind shifted and beneath his own voice, another spoke. It was faint, but unmistakable. It spoke in perfect unison with him, word for word, tone for tone. He froze. The wind died. The silence pressed in. Then he heard it again, a whisper that was his own voice returning from the dark. And though he tried to convince himself it was an echo, something inside him knew, the void had begun to answer. With that said, thanks for watching, and until next time. Have you ever mistaken your own voice for something divine? The guardsman thought about that as he walked through the wasteland, each step echoing faintly in the dead air. The voice had followed him for days now, soft, familiar, never louder than a breath. It came when he prayed, when he whispered, when he dreamed. At first, he believed it was the Emperor returning to him, finally breaking the silence. But the more he listened, the more he realized it wasn't guiding him, it was mirroring him. Repeating. Reflecting. Like a sound trapped in an endless chamber, growing fainter each time it came back. He didn't know when the fear began. It crept in quietly, like frost spreading across glass. The thought that perhaps there was no voice of the Emperor, only his own madness feeding on the hunger for meaning. He tried to banish it with the old rituals, lighting makeshift candles, murmuring the litanies of purity, cutting the flesh of his palm and pressing it to the aquila carved on his chest plate. The pain always used to remind him that he was still human, still faithful. Now it was just pain. The blood dripped into the sand and vanished without a trace, as if the earth itself refused to bear witness. One night, he came across a settlement, or what was left of one. Scattered shacks built from the bones of tanks and the wings of crashed aircraft, every wall painted with scripture that had long since faded. The people there were pale and thin, their eyes wide and distant, their bodies trembling with the devotion of the desperate. They called themselves the listeners. They gathered in a circle around a broken Vox unit, whispering prayers into its dead channels, hoping for divine reply. When the guardsman approached, they greeted him as if he were a prophet, their faces lighting up with brittle hope. "You've heard him," they said. "You've walked with his voice. You've seen what we cannot." He wanted to tell them the truth, that he didn't know what he'd heard, that the voice was his own, but the way they looked at him silenced the confession. Their eyes glimmered with something fragile, something he couldn't bring himself to break. So he knelt with them. Together, they prayed into the static. Hours passed. The air grew colder. The Vox crackled, once just a flicker of sound, like a breath drawn between words. The listeners gasped. Some wept. One fell to their knees, screaming praise. The guardsman's heart thundered in his chest. He leaned in close, every muscle trembling. And then he heard it, a whisper, faint but clear. It said his name. The others didn't seem to hear it. They only cried and shouted, their faith reignited by the mere hint of a voice. But he heard the truth. It wasn't the emperor who spoke, it was the same echo that had followed him for days, the same whisper shaped from his own voice. The moment he realized it, his body went cold. He rose without a word and walked away, their cries fading behind him, swallowed by the wind. That night, sleep refused him. He sat beneath a dead tree, staring at the horizon. The whisper returned, closer now, almost gentle. It didn't command. It didn't bless. It simply spoke, like a friend recounting old memories. You prayed to the stars. It said softly. But they never looked back. Only I did. He pressed his hands over his ears. You're not real, he muttered. You're just me. Just the noise of my own mind. The whisper chuckled his chuckle, twisted by distance. Then who are you talking to? His breath caught. His pulse thundered in his ears. For a long while, he said nothing. The stars watched from above, silent and cold. When he finally found the strength to speak, his voice was shaking. If you're me, he said, then you know what I want. You know what I've been searching for. The whisper answered with a single word: faith. He closed his eyes. The word sank into him like a blade of glass. Because in that moment, he understood, it didn't matter if the voice was divine or delusion. Faith had never been about truth. It was about endurance. About clinging to something when every reason to believe was gone. He rose and began walking again. Each step felt heavier than the last, but his resolve hardened. He didn't know where the path led, perhaps to death, perhaps to revelation, but he would follow it until his body broke. And as he walked, the whisper followed, quieter now, almost comforting. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel alone. With that said, thanks for watching, and until next time. Do you know what madness feels like when it no longer frightens you? It feels like faith. The guardsman walked for what might have been weeks. Time had lost its shape. The sun burned pale and distant, the nights were heavy with silence, and the line between prayer and delirium blurred until it vanished entirely. He no longer cared if the voice in his head was divine or imagined. It was company. It was purpose. It was enough. He reached the edge of a valley where colossal statues of saints lay toppled in the dust. Their marble faces were shattered, their hands outstretched toward a heaven that no longer answered. The air was thick with ash, and the only sound was the crunch of his boots and the whisper that trailed him like a shadow. Sometimes, it murmured comfort, soft, almost kind. Other times, it mocked him in a tone that sounded too much like prayer. You walk for him, it said one night. But he never asked you to. He tried to shut it out, but it was inside him now, threaded through his heartbeat. He began to wonder if this was how prophets were born, through madness so complete that the world itself started to speak back. The thought frightened him, but he clung to it. If he was mad, at least his madness had meaning. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, he saw light flicker in the distance, a glow unlike fire, soft and golden. His chest tightened. It could only be one thing, a shrine. The stories had spoken of it, the shrine of the silent god, where the emperor's presence was said to linger strongest, where his silence itself was sacred. The guardsman's legs trembled as he approached, a rush of hope flooding through the cracks of his despair. The path wound through broken pillars and the remains of ancient banners, their fabric rotted but their symbols still faintly visible. The air was heavy with incense that shouldn't have been burning after so many centuries, and as he stepped closer, the whisper in his head grew fainter, as though afraid. When he reached the great gate, he fell to his knees. The structure loomed before him, half ruined, half divine, its golden doors carved with the likeness of the emperor, his eyes closed, his face serene. For the first time in months, the guardsman wept. "I've come so far," he said, voice trembling. "I've done all that was asked. I believed when belief hurt. Please, just let me hear you once more." The silence that followed was deep and endless, the kind that made the soul ache. But then, something stirred within the shrine. A sound, a heartbeat, faint but real. The golden doors shuddered, dust falling like holy ash. He rose slowly, breath catching, and pushed them open. Inside, the air was thick and ancient. The walls were covered in markings, prayers, carved into the stone by countless hands. Some fresh, some worn to nothing. At the center stood a throne, massive and decayed, its gold dulled by time. Upon it lay a figure, not the emperor, but something smaller. A body wrapped in tattered robes, slumped forward, a lasgun resting across its knees. The guardsman stepped closer, his heart pounding. The face beneath the hood was familiar. Too familiar. His hands shook as he reached forward and pulled the hood back. It was him. Or rather, it had been him, his face, younger, unscarred, serene in death. The corpse had been there so long that even the dust respected it. And behind him, written across the walls in jagged, desperate letters, were prayers, his own words, over and over again. Thousands of them. Pleas for guidance. Cries for meaning. Promises to never stop walking. The realization struck like a hammer. He had been here before. He had prayed, died, and begun again, his faith looping endlessly through time and space, echoing back at itself, each iteration chasing the same silent God. The voice he'd been hearing was not divine. It was his own ghost, calling from lives forgotten. He staggered backward, gasping, his mind fracturing beneath the weight of it. The whisper returned, louder now, trembling with something that almost sounded like sorrow. "You've always been faithful," it said. "You just never knew when to stop." He dropped to his knees before the throne, eyes wide with horror and awe. "Then what am I?" he whispered. "A servant? A fool? A memory?" The whisper hesitated, then answered, "All of them." He looked up at the lifeless throne, its gold reflecting faintly in the dying light. Somewhere deep within the silence, something shifted like a breath drawn by a sleeping god. The air trembled. For the briefest heartbeat, he thought he heard another whisper, not his, not the echo. A new one. Warm. Gentle. But it was gone before he could be sure. He closed his eyes, the truth settling in like dust on armor. There would be no answers. No divine voice. Only the endless cycle of faith and silence. The emperor did not speak because he didn't need to. It was the silence that kept men walking, kept them believing, kept them alive. The guardsman bowed his head and smiled a small, tired smile. If this was his fate, he would embrace it. With that said, thanks for watching, and until next time. What if the silence was never punishment at all? That thought lingered in the guardsman's mind as he knelt before the empty throne. The air inside the shrine felt heavy, alive, humming with something ancient that pulsed beneath the stillness. His reflection, the body he had found sitting lifeless upon the throne, seemed to watch him even in death. Dust swirled lazily through shafts of pale golden light, each mote drifting like a lost prayer. He should have felt despair. Instead, what filled him was something stranger. Quieter, a weary understanding. He looked at his hands, cracked and trembling. They were the same hands that had written the prayers carved into the walls. The same hands that had once held a weapon in the name of faith, in the name of the emperor who had never spoken. He had begged for answers, fought for them, bled for them, and found only himself waiting at the end. Maybe that was the truth of devotion, not revelation, but reflection. Not divine words, but human endurance echoing through eternity. The whisper in his mind softened now, no longer mocking or fearful. It sounded almost tender. You were never meant to find him, it said. You were meant to remember him. The words drifted through him like the remnants of a dream, neither comforting nor cruel, simply true. He rose slowly from his knees, the weight of realization settling into his bones. Around him, the prayers carved into the wall seemed to shimmer faintly in the dying light. They were not just his words, they were countless voices layered across ages. Every lost soul who had come here seeking the same impossible thing, proof that their suffering mattered. Proof that their faith was seen. As he moved deeper into the chamber, he found something beneath the throne, an old candle, melted to a stump, its wax fused with the stone. He picked it up, cupping it in his palms as if holding something sacred. When he breathed across its surface, a small flame flickered to life. It burned weakly, its light golden and trembling, but it burned. For the first time in what felt like centuries, warmth touched his skin. And then he heard it. A sound not of words, but of presence. It wasn't the Emperor's voice, no thunder, no divine command, but something purer. A pulse, steady and deep, like the heartbeat of the universe. He realized it had always been there, hidden beneath the noise of his own longing. The Emperor hadn't abandoned him, he had never needed to speak. His silence was the space in which faith lived, the void that gave meaning to the act of believing. The guardsman's tears fell silently, tracing lines through the grime on his face. I understand now, he whispered. You don't speak because we already know what you'd say. The silence that followed was not empty this time. It was full of the breath of every soldier who had ever whispered a prayer before dying, full of every cry that had risen from the trenches to the stars. It was the sound of the Imperium's heart, beating endlessly, quietly, faithfully. He placed the candle at the foot of the throne and turned to leave. The golden light stretched across the floor, following him like a blessing. As he stepped outside, the wind met him, not cold this time, but warm, carrying the faint scent of incense and ash. The wasteland that once seemed endless now shimmered under the pale dawn, and for the first time in his memory, he didn't feel alone. He knew he would keep walking, keep praying, keep believing, not because he expected an answer, but because the silence was the answer. Faith was not a conversation. It was a promise kept in the dark. Behind him, in the shadow of the ruined shrine, the candle's flame flickered once and went out. But in that single moment, before it faded completely, the air shimmered with a voice too soft to be real, too sacred to be imagined. Well done, my son. The guardsman didn't turn. He simply smiled, shoulders heavy but heart unburdened, and walked into the light. With that said, thanks for watching, and until next time. Do you know what peace feels like when it no longer needs to prove itself? It feels like surrender without defeat. The guardsman walked beyond the shrine with steps that no longer trembled. The silence that once gnawed at his mind now followed him like a companion, quiet, steady, patient. The golden horizon stretched endlessly before him, and though the world was still ruined, its decay no longer seemed cruel. The ruins were beautiful in their own way, monuments to the faith of those who refused to vanish. He felt as if he was walking through the afterthoughts of gods. The voice that had haunted him for so long no longer spoke. Not in words, at least. It breathed through the wind, whispered through the dust, hummed in the beat of his pulse. Every sound in the air, every shift of sand, carried a kind of sacred rhythm. He realized that the silence had not been absence, it had been patience. The Emperor had not turned away, he had simply waited for the noise of his own desperation to fade, so that truth could finally be heard in the quiet that followed. He found himself returning to the same prayers he had once spoken with trembling lips, but now they felt different. The words no longer begged. They remembered. Each syllable was a reminder, a fragment of the light that had carried him through the long dark. He no longer prayed for the Emperor to speak. He prayed to be worthy of his silence. Days passed, though time no longer mattered. He came across the ruins of an old city, its towers collapsed and streets swallowed by ash. There were no signs of life, but faint tracks of boots led through the dust. Others had passed this way. Pilgrims, perhaps. Seekers like himself. The thought filled him with an ache that was neither sorrow nor joy. The Imperium was vast, endless, filled with the footsteps of the faithful. Maybe all of them were walking through the same silence, chasing the same unseen light. He stopped at what had once been a plaza. In the center stood the broken remains of a statue, a warrior saint, half buried in rubble, its hand raised as though still offering blessing. The guardsman brushed the dust from its face, revealing a faint, eroded smile. For a moment, he saw himself in that expression, worn, tired, but unbroken. He placed his hand upon the statue's chest and whispered, "We all hear him in our own way, don't we?" No answer came, and none was needed. As night descended, he built a small fire from scraps of wood and metal, the flame flickering weakly in the wind. He sat beside it, watching the sparks rise toward the stars. The galaxy above looked vast and merciless, an ocean of cold fire stretching without end. Once, that sight had filled him with dread, the thought of his smallness beneath such immensity. But now, he found comfort in it. To be a single flicker in an infinite dark was not meaningless. It was divine. He thought of the sister he had met, still praying to the dead altar. He thought of the servitor, repeating the same prayer for centuries. He thought of the pilgrims whispering into broken machines. None of them had ever heard the emperor's voice, yet they all believed. That was the secret of it all. The emperor did not need to speak because faith had already made his voice eternal. It lived in the echoes of those who refused to stop hoping. The guardsman closed his eyes, listening to the fire crackle. The warmth against his hands reminded him of the candle in the shrine, the last flicker of gold before the dark. He wondered if anyone else would ever find it, kneel before that empty throne, and hear what he had heard. Maybe they would. Maybe that was how the Imperium survived, not through answers, but through echoes. Every believer adding their whisper to the endless quiet until it became something holy. The wind rose, carrying the faint sound of distant chanting so soft it could have been memory. He smiled, pulling his cloak tighter, and looked toward the horizon where the first light of dawn was breaking. He had walked through war, through madness, through silence, and found something that words could not name. Not faith. Not revelation. Something simpler, deeper: acceptance. He stood, gazing at the rising sun bleeding gold across the dead world. It felt like the emperor's gaze, vast and unblinking, not demanding worship but understanding. And in that moment, the guardsman whispered one final prayer, not to be heard, not to be answered, but simply to be. For every silence, there is a soul still listening. He turned away from the light, stepping into the long road that disappeared into the horizon. Behind him, the fire dimmed, leaving a faint trail of smoke rising like incense to the stars. The wind carried his footsteps away, but his echo, his prayer, remained, mingling with the endless murmur of the faithful that would never fade. With that said, thanks for watching, and until next time. Do you ever wonder what becomes of faith when the believer is gone? When the body turns to dust, and the memory of their prayer fades into the void, does the echo still linger somewhere? The guardsman never thought he would ask such a question. But now, walking across the endless plains of ruin, he could feel something beneath the surface, a pulse that was not his own, a rhythm that whispered of uncounted lives who had once walked this same path. Each step felt like treading upon the ghosts of devotion itself. The land was silent, yes, but the silence was not empty. It was full, dense, alive, breathing with all the prayers that had ever been spoken. As the wind howled through broken cathedrals and shattered monoliths, he began to see shapes in the dust. Not illusions, not specters, but impressions, shadows carved by faith. He saw outlines of kneeling forms where pilgrims had once gathered. He saw traces of banners long since burned, still fluttering in the ghostly wind. Even the ground seemed marked by sacred footsteps, worn smooth by generations of belief. And somewhere within that invisible chorus, he realized the truth that the Emperor had never been silent. The galaxy itself had been speaking all along. Every ruin was a hymn. Every scar, a psalm. Every life, no matter how small or forgotten, was a verse in the Imperium's endless prayer. He paused, kneeling among the remnants of what might have once been a chapel. Its walls were gone, but its foundations still held the weight of devotion. The air carried the faint smell of burned incense and oil. He pressed his gauntlet to the ground, and for the first time in a long while, he did not pray for strength or deliverance. He prayed simply to remember to keep alive the memory of those who had believed, who had fought, who had died whispering the Emperor's name into the void. Because perhaps that was the true meaning of immortality in a universe so cruel, to be remembered by another. Even if only in a breath. A single candle lay buried beneath rubble, its wax long hardened, its flame long dead. Yet when he picked it up, he felt warmth in it still. He held it close, imagining the countless hands that might have lit it before him. Each one believing it would make the darkness bearable. He smiled faintly, and for a fleeting moment, the wind itself seemed to flicker with golden light. It was not fire, not real flame, but the illusion of it, the reflection of hope that refused to die. He understood now that faith was not about hearing the Emperor's voice or seeing his hand move. Faith was about carrying his silence like a torch, knowing it would never go out so long as someone still believed. The Emperor did not grant miracles, he inspired endurance. And endurance was the closest thing to divinity a mortal could ever achieve. The Guardsman rose, clutching the candle as though it were a relic. His armor was cracked, his body weary, but his eyes were alive with quiet purpose. The galaxy was still burning, still tearing itself apart under gods of chaos and greed. Yet for all the horror, for all the madness, there was still something unyielding, a golden thread that tied the living to the dead, the broken to the divine. That thread was faith, and it ran through him now like a pulse. He looked to the sky once more. The stars were distant and cold, but he saw in their light the faint glimmer of something eternal. Perhaps that was all humanity ever needed, not salvation, not certainty, but the courage to keep walking toward a light they could never quite reach. Because in the end, the reaching itself was the miracle. He turned away from the ruins, his cloak billowing in the wind, and began his long march once again. Every step echoed softly, fading into the golden dust like a heartbeat, steady, faithful, eternal. With that said, thanks for watching, and until next time. Do you ever wonder if the gods ever watch us not as beings of power, but as witnesses of our endurance? The Guardsman thought about this as he wandered deeper into the wasteland, where the horizon melted into dust and the sky burned with dying suns. The silence was almost unbearable here, but not empty. It was full of unseen eyes, watching, waiting, perhaps even judging. He could feel the weight of their gaze, not as punishment, but as curiosity. What did it mean, after all, for a mortal to keep walking when there was nothing left to walk toward? What did it mean to believe when even faith seemed to rot under the touch of chaos? The air shimmered with heat and strange colors, blues that turned to violet, golds that pulsed and faded. Xianqi's presence was here, subtle yet suffocating, woven into the fabric of the world like a disease that whispered in beauty. The Guardsman could feel the change pressing at the edges of his thoughts, twisting memories, offering impossible promises. He heard faint laughter, like the rustling of feathers in an endless storm. It spoke not in words, but in visions, his home, untouched by war, his comrades, alive and smiling, the Emperor himself, reaching down with a hand of fire. For a moment, he almost reached back. But then he remembered the shrine, the silence, and the golden light that had asked for nothing. The visions flickered and cracked. The laughter turned to hissing. He whispered a prayer, not of defiance, but of remembrance. Change cannot touch what is already broken, he said quietly. And I have been broken long enough. The landscape shifted, the illusions shattered, and once again he stood alone beneath the bleeding sky. Yet in that solitude, he felt something strange, a kind of freedom. He realized that the true horror of change was not transformation, but temptation. To promise meaning where there was none, to offer beauty where there was only decay, to twist faith into something self-serving. The chaos god thrived on the weakness of hope, the desire to see results, to control the divine. But the emperor's silence was the perfect answer to that. It offered nothing but endurance, no comfort, no reward, only the will to continue. And in that absence of promise lay true strength. The guardsman began to laugh softly, the sound dry and tired but real. "You can't unmake me," he said into the wind. "I am not yours to change." His words scattered into the dust, swallowed by the wind, but he didn't care. The act of saying them was enough. Somewhere deep within him, he felt a pulse, faint, steady, human. The kind of heartbeat that had carried the Imperium across millennia of suffering. He kept walking until the horizon glowed faintly with the promise of another dawn. The light was thin, uncertain, but it was enough to cast his shadow forward, long and stretched across the ground. That shadow was all that remained of him, a symbol of persistence. And maybe that was all the emperor ever needed from his children, not victory, not purity, but the refusal to stop moving. He whispered a final thought to the wind: "Faith is not about surviving the gods, it's about surviving yourself." The words lingered, half prayer, half confession, and then disappeared into the endless dust. The sky shifted once more, the colors fading back to muted gold. The laughter of change was gone, replaced by the faint hum of silence, the emperor's silence. The guardsman smiled beneath his helmet, a small, human gesture that defied the cosmos. He adjusted his pack, took one more breath of the dry, sacred air, and marched on into the unknown. Somewhere behind him, the ruins of the past crumbled further, but their echoes remained proof that even in a galaxy of monsters, something human still endured. With that said, thanks for watching, and until next time. Do you ever think about what it means to be remembered in a galaxy that forgets so easily? The guardsman found himself asking that question as he reached the edge of the wasteland, where the sands turned to stone and the ruins gave way to mountains. The sky above him shimmered with dull light, the stars veiled behind storms of ash. There was no civilization here, no sign of the Imperium's reach, only silence and the slow decay of time. Yet even here, among the emptiness, he could feel history breathing beneath his boots. Every rock, every crack, every gust of wind carried the weight of those who had come before. He found remnants of a camp long abandoned, half buried in dust. Torn banners lay scattered, the Aquila symbol faded and brittle. A helmet, split in two, rested beside an empty lasgun. He knelt, brushing the dirt away, and whispered, "We fought the same war, didn't we?" He did not know who they had been, Imperial Guard, Asteroids, maybe even simple pilgrims, but it didn't matter. Their story was his story, their struggle his own. They had died believing the Emperor watched them, and in some way, he still did, through the eyes of those who remembered. As he searched the ruins, he uncovered a small metal tablet, engraved with faint script: "He is the light we cannot see, but the warmth we still feel." The words were nearly erased by time, yet their meaning struck deep. He realized then that remembrance was not about names or monuments. It was about the feeling that lingers, the warmth left behind when faith refuses to fade. The Imperium did not survive on soldiers or machines. It survived on echoes, on the stories passed from one dying breath to the next. The guardsman placed the tablet back among the stones and stood in silence for a long time. The wind howled through the mountains like a choir of the dead, and for a moment, it sounded like voices whispering prayers, battle cries, and the soft weeping of the faithful. He listened, not with fear, but with reverence. The galaxy was not empty, it was full of memory. Every world scarred by war, every shrine reduced to dust, every whispered prayer, all of it was the Emperor's true cathedral. He thought about how many had fallen believing their actions meant nothing. How many soldiers had died nameless, how many worlds had burned unnoticed. And yet, he was here, standing on their ashes, breathing their legacy. Maybe that was the point, meaning did not die with the body, it passed on, quietly, invisibly, like the light of a dying star traveling through the void long after the star itself was gone. He took a slow breath and looked toward the mountains, where faint golden light began to seep between the clouds. Dawn again. Always dawn, no matter how many nights had come before. It struck him that this was what remembrance truly was, a dawn that never stopped returning, each day reborn from the ashes of the last. The guardsman adjusted his weapon and began to climb, his boots echoing against the stone. The air grew colder, thinner, but his resolve did not waver. He was not climbing toward victory or revelation. He was climbing simply to continue to be another step in the chain of endurance that bound all humanity together. Somewhere, unseen, he imagined millions of others doing the same, each in their own quiet way, all connected by an unspoken prayer: do not let the light die. When he reached the first ridge, he paused to look back. The wasteland stretched endlessly, shimmering beneath the dawn. It looked peaceful, almost holy. He raised his hand in silent salute to the fallen, to the forgotten, to the unbroken. You are remembered, he whispered, and for the first time, he believed it. He turned back toward the rising sun, the golden light washing over his armor, making it gleam like something ancient and sacred. The silence that followed was not lonely, it was full. Full of voices, full of faith, full of everything humanity had ever been and refused to stop being. With that said, thanks for watching, and until next time. Do you ever wonder what happens to a man when there is nothing left to fight, no one left to serve, and no war left to die in? The guardsman thought about that as he climbed higher into the mountains, where the air was sharp and thin, and the clouds hung low like veils of pale smoke. Every breath burned in his chest, every step echoed like the beat of a slow drum. The world below him faded into a blur of gold and ash, endless and distant. Up here, there was no sound of war, no cries of the dying, only the wind whispering through stone, ancient and eternal. It felt like walking on the edge of the Emperor's dream, where faith and silence met. He stopped beside a ridge and looked out over the world that had once been alive with devotion. From this height, even the ruins looked small, shrines reduced to pinpricks, cathedrals swallowed by shadow. Yet despite the decay, he felt no despair. Instead, he felt clarity, a strange kind of peace that only comes when everything else is stripped away. The Imperium, the chaos, the endless war, they all seemed like echoes of something older, something simpler. Perhaps all of creation was just a cycle of belief and forgetting, of gods rising and falling in the minds of mortals. And maybe, in that cycle, the Emperor had chosen not to speak because he wanted humanity to learn how to listen. The guardsman sat on a jagged stone and closed his eyes. For the first time, he wasn't searching for meaning or waiting for a sign. He just listened. The wind whistled through the crags, carrying with it faint murmurs, words too soft to understand, yet familiar. It was not the voice of a god or daemon, but something human. It was the sound of countless souls breathing as one, of soldiers whispering prayers before battle, of mothers mourning sons, of saints burning in the light of faith. It was the heartbeat of the Imperium itself, flawed, fragile, but alive. He realized then that his journey had never been about finding the Emperor. It had been about remembering what it meant to be human in a galaxy that had forgotten. Humanity's strength had never been in its power, but in its persistence, in its refusal to die quietly. The Emperor did not need to speak because his will was already alive in every soldier who stood their ground, in every pilgrim who walked toward an altar, in every whisper of hope that defied the void. As he opened his eyes, he saw something on the horizon, a faint glimmer of light, soft and golden, hovering just beyond the clouds. It wasn't the Emperor. It wasn't a vision. It was the dawn breaking once more, painting the world in its ancient glow. He smiled beneath his helmet. Dawn always returned, even after the longest night. Perhaps that was the Emperor's final gift, not victory, not salvation, but the promise of another beginning. He stood, letting the wind tear at his cloak, the golden light reflecting off his cracked armor. Below, the world waited burning, broken, beautiful. He felt no fear, no hesitation, only the quiet understanding that he was part of something endless. He had walked through chaos and silence, through despair and revelation, and found that faith was not about hearing answers. It was about walking forward anyway. He turned from the light and began his descent, each step steady, unhurried. The mountain echoed faintly behind him, carrying the sound of his boots like a hymn. He was just one man, one forgotten guardsman among billions, but he carried the weight of an empire's belief in his heart. And that was enough. The wind rose once more, whispering his name to the stars before falling silent again. The galaxy continued to turn, vast and indifferent, yet somewhere within that indifference, something sacred endured, a single soul walking onward, faceless but unyielding. With that said, thanks for watching, and until next time. Do you ever wonder if eternity is not a place, but a feeling, a moment stretched beyond time, where the soul finally understands why it had to suffer? The guardsman thought of this as he descended the mountain, his body weary, his armor dented and heavy with dust. Yet his mind felt light. Almost untethered, as though each step downward carried him closer not to an ending, but to understanding. The air was warmer here, filled with the scent of ash and faint traces of life. A rare thing, in a world claimed by silence. He could hear insects in the distance, the faint crackle of fire, the whisper of water far below. The galaxy was not entirely dead, after all. Something still breathed within its wounds. He found a narrow stream cutting through the rocks, glimmering like silver in the faint dawn. The water was clear, impossibly clean for a world so corrupted. He knelt beside it, removing his gauntlet, and let the cold touch of it run across his hand. It was the first time in years he had felt something purely alive. He stared at his reflection in the surface, helmeted, faceless, a figure carved from war and endurance. There was no man left there, only purpose. But even that, he realized, was enough. Purpose was life. He thought back to the soldiers he'd fought beside, to the commanders who had fallen, to the preachers who had promised that faith would save them. None had been wrong, yet none had truly understood either. Faith did not save, it sustained. It was the thin line between despair and endurance, between madness and meaning. And perhaps that was why the emperor had chosen silence. Because words could be corrupted, but silence could not. Silence was eternal. It waited, patient and unchanging, until the believer was ready to hear it. He drank from the stream, the cold water burning down his throat, and felt his heartbeat steady once more. Every breath he took now felt deliberate, sacred, as if the air itself carried prayer. He realized how many countless others across the Imperium must be doing the same, breathing, surviving, enduring. Not in grand temples or battlefields, but in the forgotten corners of dying worlds. They were all threads in the same tapestry, woven by belief and bound by silence. The guardsman stood again, watching as the wind rippled across the water's surface, scattering his reflection into fragments. Maybe that was what humanity truly was, a broken reflection of something divine, scattered across the stars, each piece shining faintly in the dark. The emperor didn't need to gather them, he only needed them to keep shining. Even if they never saw his light, they carried it within themselves. He began to walk once more, following the stream down through the valley. The path was narrow, flanked by dead trees that reached toward the sky like blackened fingers. Yet in the cracks of the earth, he saw small blooms, tiny flowers, white and gold, fragile but defiant. He smiled faintly. Life persisted even here, in the ruins of faith and fire. That was the true miracle, not the grand wars or holy visions, but this, the simple refusal to die. The sun had risen higher now, spreading soft gold over the barren world. It gleamed on his armor, turning the cracks and scratches into lines of light. He moved like a shadow through that glow, neither saint nor hero, just a man who had learned to walk in silence. And in that quiet, he found what he had sought all along, not revelation, but peace. He knew the war would never truly end. The Imperium would burn, rebuild, and burn again. Gods would rise, and men would fall. Yet somewhere, between those endless cycles, faith would always remain unbroken, unseen, eternal. It lived not in words, but in the act of continuing. As he disappeared into the valley, the sound of the stream faded behind him, replaced once more by the soft hum of wind. The silence returned, vast and infinite, yet this time it did not feel empty. It felt alive. It felt whole. With that said, thanks for watching, and until next time. Do you ever wonder how a story truly ends? Whether it ends when the last word is spoken, or when the last believer stops whispering a prayer? The Guardsman wondered this as he reached the valley's end, where the stream finally vanished into the sand. The air was still, the light golden and soft, falling over the ruins like a final blessing. He stopped there, standing among the bones of what once was, and felt a strange calm settle over him. There was no triumph, no revelation, no voice from the heavens. Only silence, and yet, that silence was everything. He looked back at the path he had walked, the ashes of shrines, the whispering ruins, the mountains that had torn at his flesh and tested his soul. Every step had been a question, every breath an act of defiance. He had searched for meaning in the Emperor's silence, cursed it, feared it, and finally understood it. The silence was not absence, it was mercy. Because if the Emperor had spoken, if he had revealed himself in full, there would have been no need for faith. And without faith, there would be no humanity left at all. The Guardsman took off his helmet, feeling the wind against his scarred skin. For the first time, he allowed himself to breathe freely, without the weight of duty pressing down on him. His face, unseen for years, was ordinary, tired, aged, and human. The kind of face that could have belonged to anyone, and perhaps that was the point. He was no hero, no saint, no chosen messenger. He was simply one of billions who had lived, fought, and prayed in the dark. But in that ordinariness, there was something sacred. Something eternal. He knelt and pressed his hand into the dust. The warmth of the dying sun seeped through his fingers, and he whispered softly, "We were never meant to be perfect. Only faithful." The words drifted upward, carried by the wind, dissolving into the golden light. And for a heartbeat, just one, he felt it. Not a voice, not a vision, but a presence. Vast, patient, eternal. The silence itself had answered. He smiled then, small and weary, and stood once more. He placed his helmet beside the stream bed, its surface catching the last rays of sunlight, glowing faintly like a relic left for someone yet to come. Then he turned toward the horizon. The sky burned with the colors of an ending day, orange, red, gold blending into the infinite dark beyond. He began to walk, his shadow long behind him, fading into the dust. As the last light touched him, he thought of all who would come after, the pilgrims, the soldiers, the broken and the faithful. They would tell stories of heroes and saints, of gods and monsters. His name would never be among them. But his prayer, his silence would live on in theirs. The Imperium would endure, as it always had, carried on the backs of the forgotten. And when the darkness finally came, swallowing the valley in quiet, there was no fear. Only the soft hum of eternity, and the faint echo of a man who had learned that faith was not about victory, it was about persistence. In the end, there was only silence. But it was a holy silence, vast and golden, the kind that did not end, only changed. And somewhere within that endless quiet, the Guardsman's final thought shimmered like light on water. The Emperor never needed to speak. We were his voice all along. With that said, thanks for watching, and until next time.